Hello, and welcome to the Book Club of California's online live webinar presentation, The Missing Pages, The Modern Life of a Medieval Manuscript from Genocide to Justice. We will be starting shortly. Please hold on. Thank you. Good evening, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online webinar, The Missing Pages, The Modern Life of a Medieval Manuscript from Genocide to Justice. The webinar will begin shortly. Thank you. The Book Club of California live online webinar will begin shortly. Please hold on. The Book Club of California live online webinar will begin shortly.
Good evening, members and guests. I'm Sharon G., the president of the Book Club of California, and I'm very pleased to be able to personally welcome to tonight's online program, The Missing Pages, The Modern Life of a Medieval Manuscript from Genocide to Justice. We have more than 170 people joining us for this presentation. And for those of you who are new to us, the Book Club of California is a nonprofit, membership and donor-supported organization in its 107th year of preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts, with a focus on the literature and history of California and the West. The BCC publishes limited edition books, the only letterpressed scholarly journal in the country, and keepsakes. We also host a year-round series of programs, like the one this evening, on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, and more. If you're not currently a member, or if your membership has lapsed and you are interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Membership dues are modest and the benefits are many. We simply cannot do what we do without you. And I encourage all of you to visit bccbooks.org for more information. Hang on a second. Oh, I don't know what happened. To tonight's program, Dr. Heghnar Watenpaugh, she's from the University of California at Davis, will be discussing the interesting life of a medieval manuscript from its journey starting out in, I'm sorry, my screen is not messed up. She's reprising her talk from last fall in Southern California, and she'll be discussing the medieval manuscript that has gone through 7 centuries, from medieval Armenia to the killing fields of 1915 Anatolia, to the refugee camps of Aleppo, to Ellis Island, the Soviet America, and finally to a Los Angeles courtroom. Dr. Watenpaugh is a professor of art history at UC Davis, researching the visual cultures of the Middle East, including architectural preservation and cultural heritage. Her publications have won numerous awards, and her research has been supported by J. Paul Getty Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and Fulbright Hayes, among others. Earlier this year, she was named a Guggenheim Fellow and an NEH Public Scholar, and most recently, she has written an opinion piece on the Hagia Sophia's change from a museum to a mosque. I hope you enjoy this presentation as much as I did last October. Welcome back to the Book Club of California, Dr. Watenpaugh.
Thank you so much, Sharon. It's wonderful to be associated with the Book Club of California, and a wonderful organization. Thank you for hosting me last year in historic downtown Pasadena. We had a wonderful time, and we were planning to do this in San Francisco, but circumstances being what they are, we can now have this presentation online and be with friends not only from San Francisco, but from around the country. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, Book Club of California, for your invitation, Sharon, for your leadership, and Kevin Kosick for your organization. So today I want to share with you the story of how I came to write my book, The Missing Pages. The story of this book began about 10 years ago when I read in the New York Times that the world's wealthiest art institution, the J. Paul Getty Museum in Southern California, had been sued by the Armenian Church in Los Angeles Superior Court. The Armenian Church was suing the Getty for the return of 8 illuminated pages from a manuscript called the Saturn Gospels, which had been created by the greatest medieval Armenian artist, Toros Rosny, in 1256, the middle of the 13th century. So that's around the time that Notre Dame in Paris was completed. So it's that kind of Mediterranean world. Protected for centuries in a remote church, the Holy Manuscript had followed the waves of displaced people that had been evicted from their national homelands during the Armenian Genocide of 1915, over 100 years ago. So the Armenian Genocide took place around the time the Book Club of California was established. Passed from hand to hand, the manuscript ended up being cleaved into two parts, and 8 pages out of the manuscript ended up arriving in the United States, and eventually in the 1990s made their way to California at the Getty Museum. In its lawsuit, the Armenian Church asserted that the pages had been stolen, they were the property of the church, and they were a sacred object. And the Getty rejoined that they had purchased the work in good faith, and that it was a work of art, and that they were preserving it in the best possible conditions. This lawsuit really spoke to me because, as mentioned, I had been previously, for an unrelated project, a fellow of the Getty Trust. The Getty is a museum that I know very well and that I like. They do a great deal of good, and I'm also a member of the Armenian Church. So it was as if two parts of my identity had come into conflict with each other. And I wanted to know more about what had happened. What was this manuscript? What were these pages? How had they arrived in California? I returned to Los Angeles several times to view the pages. And I became really enthralled by them for a variety of reasons, one of which is that the pages were unusual in the history of Armenian art. My image, based on my image of Armenian cultural heritage following the Armenian Genocide of 1915, is encapsulated by the images that I'm showing you now. This was the most important Armenian religious shrine in the former Ottoman Empire, the monastery of St. John the Precursor in what is present-day central Turkey. You're seeing an image of it just before the First World War, and you're seeing an image of it around 1960 when it was completely destroyed. So my image of Armenian cultural heritage, and especially religious heritage, was encapsulated by these images: destruction, loss. So the fact that this particular medieval manuscript had survived, even if in a fragmentary state, was very intriguing to me. Also, as somebody who has been long interested in issues of human rights, and especially cultural rights and art, I was very aware of the recent work by historians of genocide and historians of mass violence, and the role of the destruction of culture in mass violence. I'm showing you a photograph of the Polish Jewish jurist Raphael Lemkin, who is the person who coined the legal term genocide, which came into use in the later 30s and 40s, and of course was enshrined in international law in 1948. Lemkin is the person, the jurist, who was involved in thinking about the legalities of genocide, and the intentional destruction of culture, what he called in the 1930s vandalism. The destruction of culture from the beginning was part and parcel of his thinking about genocide. So for him and for others since then, the destruction of culture, the targeting of the language of the persecuted group, the targeting of the religious heritage and religious architecture of the targeted group is not a casual, an unfortunate result of mass violence, but rather it is central. It often precedes the onset of genocide. It occurs in conjunction with genocide, and it continues long after the physical traces of the targeted group have been removed. So I was very aware of that issue and wanted to see how this particular work intersected with that. Now, since the members of the Book Club of California are people who know a lot about books and their construction, I'm going to spend a little bit of time telling you what those 8 pages are that are at the Getty. So the Getty has in its possession 8 bifolia, so 4 large sheets of parchment that folded together, as in the diagram shown to you, yield 16 folios. And 8 of these folios, in the case of the work at the Getty, are illuminated. The way the artist Roslin intended these fragments to be seen was as 8 matching sets. So here is the first matching set. You see that these 2 pages were intended to be seen across from each other. So when you opened the book, you saw these on the right and on the left. You see that the design is very similar, but it's not identical. And your eyes were meant to travel from one page to the other and to perceive these subtle differences. It was like a spot the difference puzzle, though highly sophisticated one. So this is the first matching set, the second matching set, the third matching set, and a fourth matching set. What is represented here? You see that in general, all 4 of the sets have a general similarity. We see an elaborate arch with geometric ornamentation. The arch surmounts a series of columns, and between the columns are these grids that contain a series of letters. The letters are in fact numbers in the Armenian alphabet. In medieval times also functioned as a set of numbers. So what you're seeing here is, in a way, between the columns, this is like an Excel sheet. It's an index of sorts. These are canon tables. And tables are concordance tables that show the reader of the 4 Gospels where in each of the Gospels the same event occurs more than once. So it's a way to guide the reader towards seeing how the 4 Gospels tell some of the same events. For medieval Christianity, especially Eastern Christianity, this was theologically very important because it showed the unity of the 4 Gospels, these 4 accounts of the life of Christ. They also made connections between events that, according to Christian understanding, had been foretold in the Old Testament and come to pass in the New Testament. So canon tables such as these in medieval Armenian manuscripts, and especially gospel manuscripts, would often be the most lavishly decorated areas of any manuscript. These are very different from narrative images like a nativity or a crucifixion. They're very abstract. They contain a lot of ornamentation. They also contain these very lively depictions of fruit, of animals, especially different kinds of birds. And this was part of the genius of Toros Roslin, the artist who created these pages, that he combined the high abstraction of the ornamental section with this lively, energetic, dynamic passages of the birds and the fruit and the trees that are observed from nature. And this came to be his hallmark. The Saturn Gospels was his first signed work. So the artist intended us to see these images as matching sets. However, because of the way in which the pages have been preserved at the Getty, and I'll go back to the diagram very quickly, they were originally folded together and they were part of a gathering that would be nested in the book with other gatherings and sewn together to form an entire manuscript. But since what the Getty has is this fragment, these 4 detached sheets, when they display it in the museum, you do not see the matching sets that the artist intended, but you see two sets that are related, that are on the same parchment sheet, but are not matching. For most museum visitors, this would not really be apparent. Another thing that I noticed when I began to visit this object at the Getty is this crease, this horizontal crease in the middle of the parchment sheets. And I know this is a bad photograph, but it gives you a sense of that crease. And no amount of careful conservation that the Getty had accomplished, and as we all know, the Getty's conservation Institute is the best in the world, that crease had not been eliminated. It was present. And the more I looked at this image, the more it seemed important to me to think about that crease, because it seemed to me it represented the moment when someone removed the pages from the book, folded them, and took them away. And so the crease represented the moment when the pages were folded, when they became a fragment, when they embarked on their journey away from the mother manuscript. And as I thought more and more about this, I wanted to retrace the steps of the manuscript from the place where it was created to the various places where it spent time over its 7 centuries of life until it arrived at the Getty. Because I wanted to understand not only the manuscript itself and the artist and its artistic qualities, but I also wanted to know how this extraordinary object had formed these bonds of piety, of devotion, of fear even, with the various communities where it had spent time. So I began in the Republic of Armenia, in Yerevan, where miraculously the mother manuscript of the Saturn Gospels survived. It arrived there in the 1960s, and it is preserved at the Maastricht Institute for Manuscripts. So I visited the manuscript there. It has some illuminations. It is otherwise complete, but it lacks the 8 pages that are at the Getty. Next, I traveled to Turkey, to the southeast of Turkey, to visit Haromgla, present-day Rumkale, the fortress where the manuscript was created. And here is an image of it. Rumkale, or Haromgla in medieval Armenian, was a strategically and militarily important fortress because it was located at the westernmost bend of the Euphrates River. In the 12th and 13th centuries, it was the seat of the Catholicos of the Armenian Church, meaning the patriarch of the Armenian Church. And in the middle of the 13th century, the crucial time when the artist Toros Roslin was active there, the Catholicos was a noted theologian and politician, Constantine I, who was among his other talents, bibliophile and a patron of the arts. He had assembled in Haromgla, his God-protected fortress, as Roslin called it, a whole scriptorium, a workshop of artists, binders, leather workers, jewelers, and of course, painters and calligraphers. Present-day Haromgla, it has never been excavated, and it does feature some remnants of its medieval past, including this tower that possibly was the basement or bottom section of a 12th century monastery. The structure stands. It has a smooth facade that is bisected by the straight line, and it features these 2 stelae, and here is a close-up view of one of them. And you see that the stela is beautifully carved. In this region, there's a long-standing medieval tradition of stone carving of extremely high quality. From the bottom, it features this eagle with its arms, wings outstretched, perhaps the sigil of a princely house, of the patron or the Catholicos, beautiful arabesques. And then above here, in the top part of the stela, something was there that has been scraped out. And if you look at it carefully, you will discern the bottom part of an Armenian cross. And in the corners, you will see remnants of Armenian letters that originally spelled the abbreviation for Jesus Christ, Jesus Christos. It was very important for me to go to Hromgla and to see this and to appreciate that even high up, someone at some point or a group of people had taken the trouble to come here with equipment and intentionally, deliberately erased part of this stela. They had not scraped out the eagle. They had not scraped out the arabesque. They were not against art in general, but they wanted to eliminate that which indexed Christianity, that which indexed the Armenian presence, medieval Armenian culture. And it was very important for me to visit Hromgla and to witness this in order to understand that in this particular instance, a return to the past was not possible for this manuscript. In many lawsuits or debates about restitution, the idea is that the object should be returned to where it was created, to the country where it was created. But it was very clear that here, there was no trace, no acknowledgement that Armenian culture had ever flourished, that the Armenian church had ever had a dominant presence, and that a world-renowned artist like Toros Roslin had ever created art here. So it really got me thinking about what restitution must mean in situations like this, where the present-day society, where the culture once flourished, does not want to acknowledge that this culture was ever there. From Hromgla, I moved up the mountains to the next location where the manuscript had spent time, and that was the mountain town of Zeytun. And here it was a photograph of our approach to Zeytun up in the mountains, these forbidding mountains that had intrigued so many travelers in the 19th century. While Hromgla, the castle where the manuscript was created, was a center of medieval culture, Zeytun, at the time when the manuscript arrived around the 17th century, so the manuscript remained in Zeytun from the 17th century to 1915, was a very different place. It was not a cosmopolitan hub of medieval art patronage. It was a very remote town, and it had a reputation for being an eagle's nest. So here is a description by an American traveler, Childs, who visited Zeytun, specifically drawn to it by its reputation on the eve of the First World War. And he writes, quote, "You hear more wild stories of Zeytun than of any other place in Asia Minor. Of its robbers' ward, the quarter where Zeytun brigands lived in open honor, whence they issued like heroes to roam and take toll over the country from Aleppo to the Cilician gates." So we're in a very different kind of environment, a harsh mountain society where all of these treasures from the medieval period had ended up. In Zeytun, the Saturn Gospels, so the manuscript has become known after this town where it spent several centuries. The Saturn Gospels were kept in a church in the citadel of Zeytun. What I am showing you right now is a page from the the last part of the manuscript that is still preserved in Armenia today. And you can probably notice, even if you can't read the Armenian language, that there are a number of different scripts here. That's because as time went by, various important people, usually priests, would add notations to the manuscript in order to record important things of note. Maybe you can see the numbers 1858, when a priest recorded an important historical event that was taking place. So this was one of the other intriguing things about the manuscript, is that it was functioning as a record of the history of the community where it spent time, where priests and other important people would record important events in this manuscript. What was it like to research the religious life of Zeytun with the kinds of resources that are available? I had some diagrams that had been drawn by Armenians that had been evicted from Zeytun during the genocide. Some of them were very crude, like the one you're seeing on the screen, but they had noted important landmarks. So with this information, I set out to try to understand and try to see on the ground where the spot was where the Zeytun Gospels had been kept. In this photograph from 1909, you see the citadel of Zeytun. So this was a small neighborhood, and it featured a church, Holy Mother of God. And we know from written sources that the Zeytun Gospels kept in a special iron box, in a special niche in the walls of this church, under lock and key. I have never been able to find a photograph of the church, but it's here in this photograph somewhere. It only was taken out on very special occasions to celebrate an important feast in the church calendar, or to help solidify an oath, or to mark an important occasion in the life of the community. So for the centuries that this manuscript spent in Zeytun, it was very rarely handled, which explains its very good state of preservation. Its power did not come from its beautiful images. Probably very few people saw Roslin's peerless art. Its power came from the fact that it was a sacred text. And as time went by, congregants believed that objects such as the Zeytun Gospels, that had been, as they said, left to us from the time of the kings, were not simply books, but they were objects that had power, that had agency, that made things happen in the world. Such manuscripts could be forces for good. They could heal people. One manuscript is even called Resurrector of the Dead. And some of these manuscripts would also provide curses to enemies of the community. The Zeytun Gospel's special role was as a protector of Zeytun. And in times of stress, when the mountain town was being attacked, Zeytun Gospels would be taken out of its niche in the church and paraded around town in a formal procession in order to establish an aura of protection around the city. So for the congregants in Zeytun, the artistic aspect of the Zeytun Gospels was irrelevant. It was a sacred object that did things in the world, that accomplished things in the world. Here is an image from 1909, taken by a German geographer, of some of these congregants, some of these community members in Zeytun that may have had a chance to observe the Zeytun Gospels when it was taken out on special occasions. They would have seen it raised above the congregation by the priest, so they would have seen its glittering binding rather than the peerless art of Toros Rostin. There were a few remains of Old Zeytun. This is the famous fountain of Zeytun, whose cold water is believed to have curative powers. And this is still the fountain. This is the central arch. And we're looking at this stela that you can see that something was here that has been scraped out. It is several lines of writing in Armenian. And just as we saw at Rongla, the other ornaments here, the cypress tree, the star, the other ornamental elements have not been destroyed. The destruction is very selective and very targeted. In the case of this particular act of mutilation, we actually have survivor narratives that tell the moment in April 1915 as the inhabitants of Zeytun were being ordered by the Ottoman government to go into exile, from which few would return. And it was really a death sentence. As they were being marched out of town, the military commander who was supervising the eviction of the inhabitants also ordered the mutilation of this fountain. So again, the very intentional targeting of cultural heritage was very important for me to see. It was not accidental. These were not people who were individuals who were against art in general. They were against certain kinds of signs that they felt the need to eliminate. And here is just above that central arch, a roundel that once held a small cross, and that cross has been scraped out as well. There were a few other remains of Old Zeytun, including an old bath. One of the rooms of the bath was still preserved. It is now the home of this wonderful donkey. And you can see that there was architecture here. There were stone arches, and the floor was tiled in multiple colored stones. There were remains of the old paths that led up to the mountain to further redoubts above. In 1915, as I said, at the time when the Zeytunsis were being moved out of their homes and herded into exile, one individual, a nobleman, a member of an important clan, whose last name was Surenyan, and who was the lord of the citadel, the notable family that ruled the citadel neighborhood, made the momentous decision, as they were being herded into exile, to take with him the Gospels. So he went into church and took the Gospels out of its special box and took it with him as they were forced to leave their hometown. The only photograph of a member of that family that I've been able to find is this photograph taken in 1862 of an ancestor of the individual who took the Zeytun Gospels and took it with him on the road to exile. For the noble family of the Surenyans, they were given at first special treatment. And instead of being taken on the road to exile, they were given special permission to reside for a time in a nearby town called Marash. Marash was a provincial city on the plain. Compared to Zeytun, it was much more cosmopolitan. There, the notable family came into contact with this individual, Dr. Harutyunde Hazarian, known as Dr. Artin, who was to have a fateful role, was to play a fateful role in the life of the manuscript. He was a surgeon. He practiced at the German hospital in Marash, and this is a photograph of that hospital. He was also, in addition to being a surgeon and an important member of the community in Marash, he was also very interested in history and antiquities, and he was a draftsman. And this is his hand-drawn map of Marash. And when I went to Marash to try to understand the movement of the manuscript through this town, I used Dr. Artin's hand-drawn map to understand where it had gone. Shortly after the notable from Zeytun arrived in Marash with the manuscript that he had taken with him for protection because of the power of the manuscript. That family was ordered by the interior minister, Talat Pasha, into further exile. And they were going to go to Deir Zor, which was the terminus of many of the death caravans during the Armenian genocide. Dr. Artin, the surgeon, was exempt from deportation because he had been appointed a military surgeon for the Ottoman military, so he was useful to the war effort. So he was not going to be deported. But he knew, but this is the spring of 1916, he had heard enough about what was happening to the Armenian communities of the Ottoman Empire that he knew that being ordered into further exile towards Deir Zor, the Syrian desert, was not going to be good. And because he had become acquainted with the Ishkhan, the prince, the notable from Zeytun and his family, he had seen that they had the manuscript with them. And he knew what the manuscript was because he was interested in antiquities. He was an art collector himself. He had an interest in medieval culture. He understood that the manuscript that the notable carried with him for the protection of his family was for Dr. Artin. He thought of himself not as a superstitious man. He said, I am a modern man. I am not a superstitious man. For this modern young Ottoman, the manuscript represented a work of art, as he put it, a priceless national antiquity. So you see that he sees it as a modern, educated professional. He sees the manuscript very differently from the notable, much more traditional, almost feudal man who sees the manuscript as an object with tremendous force and tremendous power that has the ability to protect him from his enemies. Because Dr. Artin realized what was about to happen, he was determined to do all he could to keep the manuscript in Marash. He knew that it was not in his power to obtain the release of the notable and his family. There was nothing he could do. They were going to be exiled. But he pleaded with them, and he obtained from them that they leave the manuscript with him. And the Ishkhan was not happy because he probably realized, and it turned out to be true, that without the manuscript, their family would not survive and they were never heard from again. So thanks to the initiative and the persuasive ability of the doctor, the manuscript survived the genocide and spent the war years in Marash in the care of Dr. Artin. Fast forward to 1920. So the war has concluded. In 1920, in this part of what was then still the Ottoman Empire, the French had established a colonial dominion of some sort called a mandate. The French and the English had, the French and the British had were in the process of dividing up among themselves various pieces of the old Ottoman Empire. And this was one of the pieces that France had determined to establish a colonial government over. In 1920, Dr. Artin was still in Marash. He was still practicing at the German hospital, but in Marash was the presence of French colonial troops that were keeping a very precarious balance in the population between the various communities where there was a lot of tension, the Armenians and the Turkish population of Marash. By this time, also early 1920, there was a movement among the Turkish populations of Anatolia that is now, that was part of, we can call them a nationalist movement at this time, who aimed at creating an independent state for themselves. And their vision of this independent state did not involve any room for their Armenian neighbors. So it is a time of great tension, and things come to a head in February 1920. series of 3 weeks, a series of skirmishes over 3 weeks that we now call the Battle of Marash, involving the French military, Armenians, and Turkish militias, both from Marash and Kemalists who have arrived from other places. This protracted battle featured many atrocities. It ended up destroying large parts of Marash, and it also marked the end of the Armenian presence in Marash. Dr. Artin, who lived in the Kubet quarter here, had already seen that his home had burned with all of his possessions. The only thing, his great art collection, the only thing he had been able to save from it had been his, the Zeitlian Gospels. The Armenians, along with Dr. Artin, had taken refuge in one of the Armenian churches. They were surrounded on all sides by their armed Turkish neighbors. At one point, the French that were keeping this very combustible situation in balance decided to withdraw, and that was the beginning of their withdrawal from all of this part of Turkey and the end of their projected mandate for that. For the Armenians who were left in Marash, this created a situation where they understood that they were going to be massacred. And that fateful night, Dr. Artin and his two sisters decided that they would try to run away and join the retreating French rather than stay in Marash and face possible massacre. And so from here, this church where they had taken refuge, they made a run for it. One of the things that they were carrying was the Zeitlian Gospels wrapped in a precious Persian shawl. This was a night of a terrible blizzard. They ran through what they called the Turkish gauntlet, where they were being fired upon. Many of their comrades in that desperate flight were killed. The Zeitlian Gospels fell from the back of one of the sisters and was lost in the snow. And for Dr. Artin, that was the last time he ever knew what happened to the Zeitlian Gospels. However, that was not the end of the life of this incredible manuscript. This is an incredible photograph of the Battle of Marash as it's taking place, taken by a 26-year-old American humanitarian worker, Stanley Kerr, from the window of the American compound. So the Gospels fell in the snow. A few days later, this man, in this family photo taken in 1912, this man, Melkon Atamian, who was a dentist, received a visitor. He was a Turkish man that he didn't know previously. And this Turkish man told him that he had been a participant in the atrocities that took place during the Battle of Marash, and he had found the book. And ever since he had found it, he had not been able to sleep. And he had kept seeing in his dreams a fearsome man with a flowing beard who commanded him to return the book to its people. And so he had come to the nearest Armenian and wanted to give the book to be cured, to be rid of this repeated nightmare. And so Melkon Atamian took the book, but he was not an educated man like Dr. Artin. He didn't know what its significance was. But he and one of his sons, Hagop, here, who was in 1913, 13-year-old Hagop and his father looked at those images and they became enthralled with it. They also knew that there was no more room for Armenians in Marash, and they had formed a plan to immigrate to the United States, where their oldest son, they already had relatives in Massachusetts, so they were going to emigrate to the United States. The Italians knew that this book was, didn't know what it was, they didn't know anything about Rostros, but they knew that it was precious. And they knew that it might be stolen from them while they were making their way to the United States. So the elder Atamian, the father of the family, decides to entrust it to the local American missionary, the Reverend James K. Lyman. And he plans to entrust this book to Lyman, and Lyman agrees to keep it in safety. He was trusted by the Armenian community. Young Hagop, 13 years old, hears this. He knows that the elders have made this decision and that's what's going to happen. But he is enthralled to this book. And at a private moment, he makes a momentous, impulsive decision. He removes, as he tells this himself many years ago in the United States, he removes some papers, some sheets from the beginning of the book, and he keeps it with him. He says, in order to show that we had existed. So the elders do entrust the book to Lyman, and the Atamians eventually made their way to the United States. This is their Ellis Island entry record, the passenger manifest of the ship that they came on. And here is the Atamian family, father, mother, and all the children that are now going to become Americans. And here is a photograph of the family a few years later that Hagop Atamian's daughter, who lives in Massachusetts, gave to me. And you can see that they've become Americans. These new Americans kept those 8 pages with them as a family heirloom. And on occasion, they would show it to trusted friends or to their parish priest. But it was only in 1994, long after Hagop had passed away and his brothers had passed away, that the pages passed to another member of the family, who in turn eventually sold it to the Getty. And that's how come the pages came to be in California. So the mother manuscript, which had been entrusted to Lyman, the American missionary in Marash, Lyman kept his word, and the mother manuscript eventually made its way to the Republic of Armenia. And the 8 pages remained in Massachusetts in the Atamian home, almost unseen for several decades, until they were sold to the Getty in 1994. And this is what had the story that had brought things to a head in a Los Angeles courtroom in 2010. After 5 years of negotiation and litigation, in November 2015, a couple of weeks before they were due in court, the Getty and the church reached a settlement. According to the settlement, the Getty acknowledged that the pages had been the historic property of the church and acknowledged their history. And the church, in turn, having taken possession of this work, donated it to the Getty, acknowledging the Getty's good custodianship and conservation. And that was the settlement, though whether it was, how it was received has been very interesting, and I'm happy to talk about it. For the art world, this was a wonderful example of a solution through negotiation and compromise, whereas for many people in the Armenian community, this was not exactly the kind of restitution that they hoped for. So for us, what does this story portend? What did I learn from investigating the history of this manuscript and what it meant to various kinds of communities over 700 years? One of the things I learned is how important artworks can be to survival, but also to resilience. The Saturn Gospels is a survivor object. Just like human survivors of the Armenian genocide, it too is a survivor. Of all the treasures and monasteries that dotted the Taurus Mountains where Zeytun was located, this manuscript is the only object that has survived. Of that lost world of Ottoman Armenians, that entire religious culture, this is the only object that has come down to our day. So it is a survivor object. It has the ability to connect us to the past, to connect us to places and communities that are not here anymore. But I think survivor objects also look to the future. They show us what can be. They show us how culture and art are central to resilience and to continuing to remake their worlds somewhere else. And so the future viewers of the Zeytun Gospels, both at the Getty in California and in the Republic of Armenia, will give this extraordinary work of art what they will. Thank you.
Heghnar, that was terrific. This is the second time I've actually heard you speak about the missing pages and the Gospels. And I don't know if you mentioned it last time, but the idea of a survivor object is such a powerful term. And I love the way you talk about it in terms of it reflects the past and the future for the object, but it also kind of relates to people, right? And everything that has transpired. That was a terrific presentation. I have a couple of questions that came our way through the Q&A and through some of the chat. So the first one that came up, and this came up a couple of times, is can you tell us a little bit about the kind of access that you had or needed to get and what that process was to access the manuscripts and some of these locations and the photos that you showed us?
So at the Getty, the pages are preserved there, and they cannot be on permanent exhibition because none of the manuscripts in the amazing Getty collection of manuscripts from around the world can be put on permanent display because manuscripts are so sensitive and have these special light and conservation needs. So once in a while in special exhibitions or when they rotate the exhibits in the manuscript gallery in the North Hall of the Getty Center, not the Getty Villa, that's where the medieval manuscripts are, the Zeytun Gospel canon tables will be on exhibition. The Getty was wonderful. The curator of manuscripts, Elizabeth Morrison, who is a formidable researcher of medieval manuscripts, has done a tremendous amount of research on the canon tables, was incredibly generous. So it was not difficult. The Republic of Armenia, the Mashdot Institute of Manuscripts, it's also very easy to do research there. It's a wonderful community of scholars. Again, the Zeytun Gospels cannot be on a permanent display because it's such a fragile object, but it is taken out on special occasions, including special religious occasions. And maybe I'll show you this image. I don't know if you can still see the PowerPoint. But in 2015, April 24, it was the Centennial Commemoration of the Armenian Genocide. And on that day, the Armenian Church had a historic ceremony where they canonized all those who had been murdered during the genocide. And on this momentous occasion, in the history of the church, they brought out the 14 most important relics of the Armenian church, including the lance here, so the lance that pierced Christ when he was on the cross. And right here in the center, right in front of the Catholicos of all Armenians, Karekin II, is the Zeytun Gospels. It is one of the 14 most sacred relics of the Armenian church, which is, of course, one of the oldest Eastern Christian churches. So at the Marenataran, the Zeytun Gospels is both an object of study and conservation, and it's admired as a work of art, but it also sometimes comes out and plays a religious role, the same role that a version of the role that it had in the past.
Can you tell us a little bit about the conservation activities that are going around, that they're doing to preserve?
Yeah, so with pleasure. So as you know, the Getty Conservation Institute is the best in the world, and their custodianship and preservation of the 8 pages is amazing. And there were plans until the pandemic of possibly thinking about some kind of joint exhibition, whether virtual or actual, or creating some kind of possibility where people would have the experience of leafing through the Gospels, and so virtually at least the Gospel would be reunited. And I think that could be a very powerfully curated exhibit. There, the Getty has been establishing a number of links with the art institution in Armenia. They gave a grant, renovate modern work of architecture near Lake Sevan. And so I really hope that this mutual respect and friendship and collaboration continues, because it has so many possibilities, and it can be so positive. After the contentiousness of litigation, I think there can be engagements with Armenia, with the Armenian community in Los Angeles, which is the second largest Armenian community outside of the Republic of Armenia. There are so many possibilities for productive engagements between museums and the community, and I hope that continues.
Yeah, I think you could probably do an entire second lecture on the litigation process and all the steps
yes.
and back and forth on that, and probably even on the settlement. You said if you had time, you could speak more about I guess the controversy or the disagreements or other potential desires for the settlement. But one of the questions was regarding the settlement, that the 8 pages, are they on loan to the Getty, or were they gifted back to the Getty by the Armenian Church? And if they were on loan, can they be, taken back? Like what is that agreement like?
So according to the agreement, in 2015, the centennial year of the Armenian genocide, highly symbolic, right? So the church took possession, was the acknowledged owner of the 8 pages. And beginning in 2016, the church exercised its right as the owner of the 8 pages to donate it to the Getty. So it's not on loan, it's a gift from the Catholicos of Cilicia to the Getty.
Got it. Question on how long have you been working on this project? Researching and writing, and traveling. It seems like a lifelong pursuit.
It was a long time. I became aware of it, as I said, in June 2010, when I read in the LA Times that the Armenian Church had sued the Getty, and I was completely stunned and surprised. And I was working on something else at the time, but it's the power of the manuscript that draws you in. I mean, it is, I have to say, it is an astonishing manuscript. Its visual qualities are, I'm an art historian. I look at art all the time, but there is something about the power of this object. It's not very big. It's very small. And in that small expanse, there are so many visual events. It's as if the page comes to life. I mean, the more you stare at these pages, the more life you see in them. It really is very difficult to explain, and I really hope all the participants have a chance to see this amazing work either in Los Angeles or in Armenia. I mean, there's a reason why Toros Roslin is celebrated as a great artist. He truly is. So I was in enthralled to this object, and it took me a long time to figure out how I would tell the story and what was the story that I wanted to tell. Did I want to talk about the lawsuit, which was very interesting, and for the art world this is very topical, and there are a lot of debates right now going on about the responsibilities of museums restituting objects that were acquired during colonialism, or objects that maybe have been stolen or trafficked in the past from war-torn zones. So that I considered doing that. But in the end, it was important for me to tell the whole biography of this object, and to talk not only about this important episode in its life, which was the lawsuit and its implication for today, but its deeper history and the webs of relationships that the object and communities and places had formed. And I felt it was very important to explore that and to tell the stories of these individuals that have been forgotten in the fog of history, or that are not considered important, or whose experience of this book is not considered important. So that's, and I have to acknowledge my editor at Stanford University Press, Kate Wall. It was really a partnership in figuring out how to tell the story, and how to tell the story in a way that is accessible to a broad audience, not only specialists of art history or theological studies, but really to connect with an audience and to connect these very complex and very interesting issues that are part and parcel of the life of this manuscript, with the various kinds of groups out there now that are interested in these issues.
And there have been a couple of questions about the book itself and Stanford University Press. You just mentioned the information is on the screen that all the attendees can see. And I also posted the same information in the chat, so you can link right from the chat if you're interested in finding out more about the book and purchasing the book right now. There is a discount code that gets you 20% off. It's in the link, it's on the screen. So please use that if you are interested in the book. We probably have time for one or two more questions. So I'm going to skim this real fast and pull up another question or two. One of them is, are there other Armenian manuscripts that have complicated journeys and interesting stories to tell that you could maybe share a little bit with us, unless it's your next book and you want to keep us like
Yes, there are many. I mean, one of the things that was so incredible for me in the journey of researching this manuscript was meeting all these people, from curators and cultural heritage activists to lay people who felt so strongly about these manuscripts. The Madenataran, the museum in Armenia that I mentioned, a couple of years ago had a whole exhibition about objects that had survived the genocide that various people had donated to that museum. It was the most moving thing. Each object or fragment of an object in that exhibition had an incredible story. I met a friend in San Francisco, Roxanne Makastian. Maybe she's one of the panelists, whose family, Roxanne also is Armenian from present-day Turkey, and their family had preserved a family Bible. And they had brought it with them from their ancestral village as they had been evicted. And these things are heavy. I mean, if you're on a death march, carrying this very heavy object, it's not a light decision when you're making the decision, should I carry water or this? But they had kept that book with them and had been in their family. And a couple of years ago, they as a family decided that it was time for the book to be repatriated, to go home. And for them, going home was to be donated to the Madenataran Museum in Armenia. And so as a family, they went and donated it. And Roxanne, who's also a filmmaker, has made a beautiful film about their family history. And so it was listening to stories like this and what these art objects that are also sacred objects mean to individuals and families at the moment of their greatest trauma, and how these kinds of objects can help them survive and help them see a future and transform themselves and look to the future. It was deeply humbling to learn that. And so, yes, there are many stories. But that's not my next book.
Oh, wait, you might have to tell us about that. I'm going to try to squeeze in 2 more questions here because I know we're running kind of towards the end there. People are asking about, you've talked about the 8 pages that are at the Getty now. Do they know where the other pages are? Are they going to be brought together at any point? Like, what can you tell us about that?
So other than the 8 pages, the rest of the manuscript is intact and is in Armenia. So thanks to the Reverend Lyman, he kept his word, and the mother manuscript, as I call it, is intact and has survived. Are the 2 going to ever be in the same physical space? I don't know. That was one of the things that was discussed during the very long and very difficult negotiations. It's possible. I don't know. I would love that to happen. But I think in contemporary cultural heritage and museum studies, there are other creative ways of addressing that are not the same as a physical unification, but provide other kinds of possibilities. So I would love it if we could imagine some kind of deeply meaningful virtual unification of the 2, the fragment and the main manuscript together.
There were a couple of questions about the coloration of the manuscripts and the illustrations, and people were wondering what you might know about that, or how that was done, or what you could share about that part of the art.
So as you can see, the colors are often described as jewel-like. They're incredibly vivid. And of course, there's a great deal of gold ink. In the scriptorium where Toros Roslin worked, they used mineral substances to make their pigmentation more brighter. And the red, you see in this image on the screen, you see these red dots on the vase. Those red dots have a 3-dimensional quality. So when you're in the presence of this page, it's really more like a relief than a 2-dimensional painting. It's really astonishing. And there has been a study of the chemical composition of these pigments, and I'm happy to send that information to the participant. Please email me. I would be delighted. I'm a book nerd. I'm an art history nerd, and I would love to share that information.
Well, I want to talk to you about your book nerdishness because you know a lot of all the book terms, and you recognize that up front, that this audience is people who know books and the art and construction of books, and you know so much about it, and in addition to all the history. And so that's really kind of fascinating. I'd love to hear more about that. Before I wrap up everything, I'm going to ask one question about that textile that's hanging on the wall behind you.
Oh,
you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. So this is a Central Asian tent hanging. And I purchased it in Aleppo. In my earlier life, I was a scholar of the architecture of Aleppo, and I spent several years in the 1990s living in that amazing and beautiful city, and my first book is about Aleppo. So it's one of those sacred objects that I have from my time in Aleppo, all my books, my photographs, of buildings that I documented that have since been destroyed in the Syrian conflict. So it's the destruction of art is something that has been on my mind for a very long time in its many different dimensions. And so, yes, this hanging is from Central Asia, but it had made its way to Aleppo, where there was a thriving antiquities market, legal legal entities market.
Of course, of course. Great. Well, thank you, Heghnar. We're at the end of our time here. Attendees, you have Hegnar's contact information on the screen. It's also going to be sent to everybody tomorrow after our lecture is over in a post-lecture email follow-up. So I just want to thank Heghnar again, our speaker. This was terrific. And thank you all for attending this Book Club of California program. I hope you'll join us for our next online program. It's called 50 Years from Wisconsin to Nepal Through the Eyes of the Quelquefois Press on Monday, August 17th, 1 week from today, 5 to 6:15 p.m. here on Zoom. This will be another live online presentation, and it's going to be by Mary Laird, who is a printer, a book artist, and a teacher. You can register for this event online at bccbooks.org/programs or using the link in the weekly programs emails that you may be receiving from the book club. Again, thank you all for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful evening. Be well and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you.